This is my true story. 20 years ago, my own 7 sons pushed me out of my home and out of their lives. They said I was old, weak, and useless. I walked away with nothing, and everyone believed I vanished forever. But what they never knew was that I was rebuilding myself in silence. But 2 decades later, I returned with a secret that shook every one of them to their knees. You won't believe what happened next. Before I tell you, please comment where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And subscribe so my stories can reach more people. 20 years ago, the people I loved most turned their backs on me without a second thought. My 7 sons, the same boys I fed, raised, protected, and worked myself half dead for, looked at me like I was a weight tied to their ankles. They had grown into men with strong hands and loud voices, but their hearts were small, cold, and filled with greed. They told me I was too old to be useful, too slow to be respected, too weak to be part of their new lives. Every word they threw at me felt like a stone, hitting the same heart that once beat with pride for them. I remember standing in the middle of my own living room as they circled me, not with love, but with impatience. They pointed at my shaking hands, my tired legs, my quiet voice, as if age was a crime I chose. They forgot the years I spent working 2 jobs so they could eat. They forgot the nights I stayed awake so they could sleep. They forgot the sacrifices I made so they could stand strong. All they saw was a man who no longer gave them what they wanted. And what they wanted was a house, money, control, and freedom. Freedom from the father who built everything they had. When they forced me out, there were no tears on their faces, no guilt, no hesitation. They didn't ask if I had somewhere to go. They didn't ask if I had food, medicine, money, anything. They didn't even let me take most of my clothes. One of them threw a small bag at my feet with a few shirts in it, like I was some stray animal they were shooing away. I looked at each of their faces, searching for the boys I remembered. The boys who once ran to me when they were scared, who once held my hands when they couldn't walk on their own, but none of those boys remained. I walked out of the house slowly, hoping, in the tiniest corner of my heart, that one of them would stop me, that someone would call out, "Wait, Dad," that someone would feel the pull of blood and love and memory, but the door slammed behind me before I even reached the end of the driveway. That sound still rings in my chest today. It was the sound of a family breaking, the sound of a father being thrown away like trash. The street was dark, the air was cold. My steps felt heavy, not because of age, but because betrayal has weight. Real weight. A weight that presses down on your bones until you feel hollow. My sons didn't lose me that night. They abandoned me. They didn't push me out. They erased me. As I stood there alone beneath the streetlights, I realized that blood ties mean nothing to people who see you only as an obstacle. I had spent decades teaching them kindness and loyalty, but in the end, they taught me something instead. Even your own flesh can turn into strangers when their hearts grow colder than the world outside. I didn't cry that night, not because I was strong, but because the pain was too deep for tears. Tears come when something hurts. This wasn't hurt. This was a tearing, a ripping, a shattering that left no room for anything else. I walked into the night with no plan, no destination, no home. Only a broken heart and a realization I didn't want to accept. The children I raised with love had thrown me away without looking back. I didn't just lose my home that night. I lost the meaning of being a father. And as I disappeared into the darkness, I knew one thing. If I ever returned, it wouldn't be as the weak old man they pushed aside. It would be as someone they never expected to see again, someone they could no longer control. Someone who carried the truth of what they did, and the strength they never believed I had. When I walked away that night, it was not just distance I created. It was a wall, a silent wall, between me and the 7 sons who no longer saw me as their father. I did not leave a note. I did not tell a soul where I was going. I simply kept walking until the streets turned from familiar to strange. I wanted the world to forget me, the same way my sons had. And slowly, it did. People whispered that I had gone mad, that I had wandered off, that maybe I died somewhere alone. Rumors are easier than truth. And the truth was simple. I disappeared because staying meant dying in front of the people who destroyed me. The first days were the hardest. I slept under bridges, in parks, on old church steps. I ate whatever I could find. I looked at strangers' faces and felt invisible. No one knew me. No one cared. And strangely, that hurt less than the fact that my own children didn't care either. I kept thinking someone would look for me. Maybe one son, just one, would feel something. But weeks passed, then months, and the silence from them told me everything. They didn't search. They didn't call. They didn't ask. They lived their lives as if I had never existed. Slowly, the world swallowed me up. My name faded. My existence faded. Even the memories I held started to slip through my fingers. There were mornings I woke up and had to remind myself who I was. The man I used to be, hardworking, respected, proud, had become nothing but a shadow. I walked through towns like a ghost, drifting from place to place, not belonging anywhere. People saw an old man with tired eyes. They didn't know the story behind those eyes. They didn't know the betrayal that hollowed out my soul. I found work where I could. Small jobs, hard jobs, jobs no one wanted. I lifted crates, washed dishes, swept floors, carried boxes. My hands became rough, my back bent, my clothes worn thin. But even in the pain, I felt something strange. Relief. Because no one expected anything from me. No one insulted me. No one called me a burden. For the first time in years, I lived without being shoved aside or criticized. I was poor, but I was free. Free from the people who should have protected me. Free from the sons who only saw me as someone to get rid of. People believed I had vanished. And maybe I had. Not physically, but as a father. As a man with a place in someone's heart. My sons never reported me missing. The neighbors stopped wondering after a while. Life moved on without me. The world forgets you quickly when you stop showing up to it. And that is how I learned a hard truth. Disappearance is not always an accident. Sometimes it is a choice forced on you by the cruelty of those who should have loved you. As the years passed, I let the idea of home fade away. I told myself I no longer had one. I trained my heart to stop longing for the voices of my sons. I forced myself to stop replaying the moment they pushed me out. I tried to forget the life I once lived. But there are memories that stay inside your bones, memories that don't fade even if you want them gone. Every birthday, I wondered if they still remembered me. Every holiday, I wondered if they sat at the table without thinking of the empty chair. Every night, I wondered if they ever felt guilt, even a little, for what they did. But guilt does not live in selfish hearts. That much I learned. My disappearance did not haunt them. It freed them. They wanted me gone, and they got exactly what they wished for. I disappeared so completely that even I stopped recognizing myself. But disappearing did not kill me. It changed me. It stripped away everything weak inside me and left only the part that could survive. And I told myself, if the day ever came when I returned, it would not be as the man they threw away, but as someone they never saw coming. I disappeared from their world, but I did not disappear from life. I walked away from the pain, not because it was easy, but because staying meant letting them finish what they started. And even in the darkest nights, some small part of me whispered that I would rise again. And when I did, they would face the man they believed would never return. Those early years after I disappeared were the hardest years of my life, but they also became the years that rebuilt me into someone my sons never expected. When you lose everything, your home, your family, your purpose, you either break completely or you start walking forward because there is nothing left behind you worth holding on to. And that is what I did. I walked. I worked. I rebuilt myself piece by piece until the man who had been pushed into the night became stronger than the 7 sons who forced him there. I found a small town far from where I once lived, a place where no one knew my name or my past. It was a town filled with simple people, hard-working people, People who didn't judge you by your age but by your effort. I started with the lowest jobs, carrying heavy boxes at the docks, cleaning old shops, fixing broken fences. My back hurt every night, my hands cracked and bled from the cold, but for the first time in a long time, every ache I felt came from honest work, not from betrayal. Pain from labor is easier to bear than pain from your own children. I saved every little coin I earned. I lived small, slept in a tiny rented room, ate cheap meals, wore the same clothes until they almost tore. I didn't waste anything. I didn't trust anyone. And I didn't complain. I took every job that came my way, and slowly, I became known in that town as the man who never said no, the man who didn't break, the man who worked harder than men half his age. People admired me, something my own sons had not done in years. With time, I learned new skills: carpentry, plumbing, small repairs. I became good with my hands. I became useful. I became needed. And with every skill I learned, I became less of the broken father who was abandoned and more of a man who could stand on his own feet again. I built furniture for people. I fixed roofs damaged by storms. I repaired old buildings no one else wanted to touch. Every task made me stronger. Every day reminded me that the man my sons threw away was not a burden. He was a survivor. After several years of work, I had saved enough to open a small workshop. Nothing fancy, just a little place with old tools and a sign that said, "Repairs." But to me, it was more than a shop. It was proof that I was not done. It was proof that life hadn't beaten me. People came to me with broken things: chairs, tables, toys, frames, and I fixed them. And in a way, fixing those things helped fix something inside me too. Slowly, I rebuilt not just my life, but my spirit. Word spread. My shop grew. People trusted me, respected me, valued me. I became someone again, someone worth something. And as my business expanded, so did my savings. I bought land. I invested. I partnered with other craftsmen. Within 10 years, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I owned properties, I owned businesses, I owned my future. All without a single hand from the sons who once said I was too old and too worthless to keep around. But the real strength I gained wasn't money. It was the knowledge that I no longer needed anyone who had thrown me away. The father they abandoned became a man far greater than the one they thought they buried, and I never told them a thing. I let them believe I was gone forever. I let them live on the illusion that they had won. But every year that passed, every dollar I saved, every piece of land I bought, every business I grew, all of it became part of a future they would never expect. I rose from the ashes of betrayal, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to prove, to myself, that I was more than the weak man they left standing in the cold. I became someone stronger, smarter, and more alive than ever before. And I knew that when the time came for me to return, I wouldn't return as the father they discarded. I would return as the man they never imagined I could become. While my sons spent the last 20 years living in the comfort of the home they stole from me, they never knew that every piece of that comfort still belonged to me. They believed they took everything: the house, the land, the businesses, the money. But they never checked the truth behind the documents. They never checked the signatures. They never checked the ownership papers. They were so sure I was gone forever that they didn't bother to look deeper. They thought time would erase me. They didn't know time was working for me. When I disappeared, I didn't just walk away from my life. I walked away knowing something important. Nothing they took was legally theirs. Every property we owned, every small shop I once ran, every field behind the house, all of it was in my name alone. They thought forcing me out meant inheriting everything, but inheritance only happens when a man is dead. And I was still very much alive, angry, hurt, betrayed, but alive. That truth alone was enough to shake the foundation of the little kingdom they built on lies and cruelty. As I rebuilt my life in that small town, I kept every document I ever had. I stored them safely. I updated them. I made sure everything remained under my control. And as my new businesses grew and my savings multiplied, I kept those under my own name too. My sons believed they were running the old businesses, making money, expanding the family name. But legally, not a single brick belonged to them. They were managers playing pretend. They were kings sitting on a throne made of paper. They lived off land that was never signed over. They used money that never held their names, and they had no idea. I watched from afar when I could. I heard rumors about them. Some bragged. Some fought among themselves over their shares. Some claimed ownership of things they didn't build or earn. They had turned greedy, jealous, bitter, fighting over a fortune they believed they controlled. But they were fighting over my property, my legacy, my work. They had built their pride on something that could be taken from them with a single piece of paper. And I carried that paper with me for years. Always folded, always safe. A reminder that life isn't as simple as pushing an old man out of his home. My sons believed betrayal would give them everything. They didn't understand the law. They didn't understand responsibility. They didn't understand that a father's name, once signed on a deed, doesn't disappear unless he chooses to erase it. Betrayal doesn't rewrite ownership. Sometimes, during long nights, I imagined how they would react if they learned the truth. Not out of spite, but out of curiosity. Would they panic? Would they fight? Would they beg? Would they regret? Or would they try to push me out again? I didn't know. But I knew this. They lived like kings while I rebuilt myself from nothing, and they never stopped to question the foundation beneath their feet. And there was more. Something even bigger. While they clung to what they thought was their inheritance, I built new businesses, new lands, new success, far greater than what I left behind. I became a man with more wealth than they ever imagined. Wealth created by my own two hands after they threw me out like trash. Wealth they knew nothing about, wealth they had no claim to. Wealth they never expected to stand in front of them. That was the secret I carried for 20 long years. A secret that grew with every sunrise. A secret that held my dignity together when loneliness tried to break me. A secret that proved I was not the useless old man they called a burden. A secret that reminded me that strength doesn't disappear with age. It deepens. My sons thought they erased me from the world, but I was building a truth that would one day erase the lies they lived in. And when the time came for me to return, I knew this secret would hit them harder than the night they forced me out. Because power is not in youth or strength or loud voices. Power is in the truth they never bothered to look for. 20 years passed before I decided to return, not because I wanted revenge, but because the time had finally come for the truth to stand in front of the people who tried to erase me. I had built a new life, a stronger life, a life made with my own hands far away from their cruelty. But a man cannot run forever. One day he must face the ghosts he left behind. And my ghosts had 7 faces, the faces of the sons who threw me out into the night without a second thought. So I went back, not as the weak father they abandoned, but as a man who had survived everything they hoped would destroy me. The journey back to my old town felt strange. The roads had changed, the buildings looked newer, the people were different. But the memories came back like old wounds reopening. Sharp, deep, unforgettable. I felt the weight of every step as I walked down the street toward the place that once held my entire life. My heart beat slowly, not out of fear, but out of the heavy truth I carried inside me. I wondered if they would recognize me. I wondered if age, struggle, and time had changed me beyond their memory. But some things can't be forgotten, especially by those who try to bury them. When I reached my old home, it looked larger than I remembered, but colder. The walls were freshly painted, the garden trimmed, the driveway clean. Everything looked perfect from the outside, but I knew the inside was filled with lies, pride, and memories of the night they pushed me out. I stood at the gate for a long moment, breathing slowly, feeling the years press against my chest. Then I walked forward and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the house. 1 knock, 2 knocks. A long silence. Then footsteps. 7 sets of footsteps. They came to the door together, like they always did when something serious was happening. When the door finally opened, the faces I saw were older, heavier, worn down by life. But the moment their eyes focused on me, everything changed. Their mouths fell open. Their eyes widened. Their bodies froze. It was as if they had seen a dead man standing on their doorstep. At first, none of them spoke. They stared at me like I was a ghost they never expected to face. One son grabbed the doorframe as if his legs were about to give out. Another covered his mouth with his hand, whispering something under his breath. The youngest stepped back like fear had pushed him. Their faces turned pale, drained of every drop of color. In that moment, I felt nothing. No joy, no anger, no revenge. Just the weight of 20 years of silence breaking all at once. I stepped forward, and the air in the doorway changed. They didn't greet me. They didn't reach out. They didn't ask why I was alive. They were terrified. Terrified of the truth standing in front of them. Terrified of the father they threw away. Terrified of the consequences they never thought they would face. I could see it in their eyes. The fear that everything they built, everything they claimed, everything they took, was no longer safe. They backed up as I walked into the house. The same house I built for them with my own sweat and pain. The same house they forced me out of without shame. Now I stood in the middle of the living room, an old man with a straight back and a steady heart, and they hovered around me like children again, not in love, but in fear. And in that silence, I realized how much power truth carries. I had come home a different man, a stronger man, a man shaped by 20 years of surviving alone. My sons had lived in comfort. I had lived in hardship. They had grown soft. I had grown strong. They had forgotten me. I had remembered everything. And now, for the first time in 2 decades, they had to face the father they abandoned. Not the weak man they once threw out, but the man who returned with a truth that could tear their entire world apart. The moment I stepped fully into the house, the air changed. My 7 sons stood around me like frightened animals, their eyes wide, their breaths shaking, their hands restless. They didn't know whether to come closer or run. I could see the panic crawling through their bodies like a shiver they couldn't control. It was the first time in their lives that they looked smaller than me, not because of my strength, but because of their guilt. They had spent 20 years pretending I no longer existed, and now I stood in their living room alive, solid, and staring at the men who abandoned me. One of them stepped forward, but his voice cracked before he could say a single word. His lips trembled like he wanted to call me father, but the word wouldn't come out. The youngest kept backing away until his back hit the wall. Another son looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes because he knew exactly what he had done. 2 decades of lies, comfort, money, and fake pride were falling apart right in front of them. They didn't look like grown men anymore. They looked like boys caught stealing something valuable, and the truth was, they had stolen something valuable. They stole their own father's peace. One of them whispered, We thought you were dead." But the fear in his voice told me the truth. They didn't think I was dead. They hoped I was dead men can't return. Dead men can't reclaim their property. Dead men can't speak the truth. Dead men can't expose their betrayal. But I wasn't dead. I was standing right in front of them, breathing, watching, remembering. And that was worse for them than any grave. They began talking over each other, trying to explain, trying to rewrite history, trying to make excuses that sounded weaker than their shaking knees. One said they were young. Another said they were overwhelmed. Another said they didn't know what to do back then. Lies, cowardice, fear. None of their words mattered. None of them erased the night they threw me out with nothing, not even a warm jacket. None of them erased the cold I felt walking alone. None of them erased the 20 years I spent rebuilding myself while they enjoyed a life built on theft. Their panic grew worse when I reached into my coat and pulled out a single envelope. Their eyes locked onto it like it was a knife. I didn't open it. I didn't say a word. I simply held it in my hand, and that alone sent their fear into a deeper place. They knew. They knew that one envelope could destroy everything they thought they owned. They knew that one signature could take away the house, the businesses, the land, the money, everything they built their lives around. One son finally broke down and sank onto a chair, holding his head in his hands. Another whispered, "Please, please don't ruin us." But there it was again, the truth in his voice. He didn't say, "Please don't leave us again." He didn't say, "Please forgive us." He said, "Don't ruin us." Their fear wasn't about losing me, it was about losing what they thought belonged to them. Their panic was not love, it was selfishness. It was greed choking them from the inside. The oldest tried to stand tall, but his legs shook so hard the floor creaked beneath him. He kept staring at the envelope, as if he could read the contents through the paper. He couldn't. But he understood its power. 20 years ago, they believed I was powerless. Now, in the same house they stole from me, they finally realized I held more power than all 7 of them combined. I watched them crumble, not with joy, not with anger, but with the calm that only years of suffering can give a man. They were trapped between guilt and fear. They didn't know if I came for revenge. They didn't know if I came to take back everything. They didn't know if I came to destroy the lives they built on top of my pain. Their panic filled the room like heavy smoke. Not one of them could hide it. And as they stood there trying to breathe, trying to understand, trying to hold themselves together, I finally understood something. The fear they felt now was nothing compared to the pain they gave me. But this time, they would face the truth head on. Not as sons who once had a father, but as men who finally realized that the man they abandoned did not stay gone. He returned stronger than ever, carrying a secret that could shake their world apart. I sat down in the center of the living room, the same room where they once laughed as boys, the same room where they later whispered about getting rid of me. My 7 sons stood around me like men waiting for a sentence. Their breathing was heavy, their eyes glued to the envelope in my hand. They didn't know what was inside, but they knew it carried the weight of their past. I looked at each of them slowly, one by one, letting the silence stretch until it hurt. They needed to feel that silence. They needed to feel the years I spent alone. They needed to understand the pain they left behind. Finally, I opened the envelope. Their shoulders tensed. Some stepped forward, some stepped back. Some grabbed the furniture like they needed something solid to hold on to. I pulled out the stack of documents and placed them on the table. Their eyes followed every move. They knew this wasn't a letter, this wasn't a message, this wasn't a memory. This was something real, something that could change everything, something they weren't ready for. I spread the papers out across the table. Deeds, titles, ownership records, legal statements, every property they thought they inherited, every business they claimed as theirs, every piece of land they built their pride on, every bank account that kept their families fed and spoiled, every single thing they believed was in their name, all of it. Not one paper listed their names. Not one document transferred ownership to them. Not one signature gave them control. Everything, every inch, every cent was still legally mine. When they saw it, their faces broke. Not in sadness, not in relief, but in pure shock. The kind of shock that drains the color from a man's face, the kind that hits deeper than fear. The kind that comes from realizing your whole life was built on a lie you created yourself. Their jaws opened, their hands trembled. Some blinked rapidly like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some looked around the room as if the walls might explain it to them. I told them I never changed the ownership, not even after they threw me out. I told them the lawyers advised me to transfer everything before I disappeared, but I refused, not out of kindness, not out of trust, but out of something heavier. The truth. I wanted the truth to be the thing that stood between us. Not money. I wanted them to live with the reality that they took advantage of a father who still held everything they depended on. I wanted them to see that while they abandoned me, the world never abandoned my rights. They were breathing like men drowning in air. One of them tried to speak. His voice cracked. Another reached for the papers, then pulled his hand back as if touching them would burn him. The youngest whispered, This can't be real." But it was real. More real than anything they had faced in 20 years. They lived in houses that weren't theirs. They ran businesses they didn't own. They borrowed money they had no right to touch. Their entire lives were built on something they never earned and something I never signed over. Then I told them the part that hit hardest. I had returned not because I wanted the property back, Not because I wanted revenge, not because I wanted to watch them fall, but because I finally wanted them to see the truth. I wanted them to understand that a father's worth isn't measured by age, or money, or usefulness. It's measured by the love he gives and the sacrifices he makes, and they threw all of that away. Their panic turned into disbelief. Their disbelief turned into guilt. Their guilt turned into silence. 7 grown men stood in front of me with the same expression. The expression of children who realized they had broken something precious. They didn't know what I would do next. They didn't know if this revelation meant punishment. They didn't know if it meant forgiveness. They didn't know if it meant the end of everything they depended on. They only knew one thing. The truth had finally caught up with them. And as they stared at the papers scattered across the table, they understood something they never expected. The father they tried to erase had returned, not with anger, but with a truth strong enough to tear down the life they built in his absence. The room went silent in a way I had never heard before. My 7 sons stood frozen, their eyes locked on the documents scattered across the table. They weren't just shocked, they were shattered. Every lie they told themselves for 20 years collapsed right in front of them. They had believed they were owners. They had believed they were powerful. They had believed they controlled everything. But now, the truth sat on the table like a hammer waiting to crush every illusion they lived in. I watched their faces change slowly, piece by piece, as the weight of reality crushed their pride. One son reached out and picked up a deed with trembling fingers. His hand shook so violently he could barely keep the paper steady. His eyes scanned the text again and again, as if reading it enough times would magically put his name where mine was. But it didn't. It never would. When he realized this, he dropped the paper and stepped back like he had just touched something dangerous. Another son rubbed his forehead hard, like he was trying to force his mind to wake up from a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was the truth, and the truth didn't care about their shock. The youngest stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. He whispered, barely audible, "Why didn't you tell us?" His voice cracked under the weight of his own question, but we both knew why. Because the day they threw me out, they made it clear I didn't matter. They made it clear my words had no place in their lives. They made it clear they didn't want a father. They only wanted what belonged to a father. That night, 20 years ago, they made their choice, and now they were living inside the consequences. Another son started pacing the room, pulling at his hair, muttering under his breath. He kept shaking his head like he was trying to undo time. But time doesn't bend. Time only reveals. And now time was revealing everything they had built for 20 years was sitting on a foundation that belonged to me, a foundation they abandoned, a foundation they never earned, a foundation they never respected. Their shock wasn't just about losing what they believed was theirs. Their shock was about facing the truth they spent 2 decades avoiding. Then, the oldest son stepped forward. He looked at me with eyes full of fear, not love. He finally understood something he never cared to understand before, that the man they once threw away still held more power than all 7 of them combined. His voice was unsteady as he said, "So, what happens now?" The fear behind that question was so loud I could feel it. He wasn't asking out of concern. He was asking out of panic. He wanted to know if I would take everything back. He wanted to know if they were about to lose their homes, their businesses, their comfort, their status, everything. I didn't answer him immediately. I let them sit in their shock. They needed to feel it. They needed to drown in it. They needed to understand what 20 years of silence feels like. They needed to taste the same emptiness they once left me with. Their shock was only the beginning. They realized they had no right to the life they were living. They realized everything they took from me was still mine. They realized that the father they abandoned didn't die, didn't break, didn't disappear. I had returned stronger, and the truth had come back with me. Another son grabbed a chair as if his legs couldn't hold him anymore. He sat down slowly, breathing heavily, sweating through his shirt. He looked around at his brothers, then back at me, his face pale. He whispered, "We didn't know. We didn't know." But ignorance is not innocence. They didn't know, Because they didn't care. They didn't ask. They didn't look for me. They didn't want to know. They wanted me gone so they could enjoy everything without the weight of loyalty or gratitude. Their shock grew deeper when they realized something else. I didn't look broken. I didn't look weak. I didn't look like the father they discarded. I looked stronger than they ever imagined. That scared them more than the documents. Because a strong man with the truth is more dangerous than a rich man with power. As they stood there absorbing every piece of the truth, they finally understood what betrayal costs. They finally understood that abandoning a father is not something time can erase. They finally understood that I came back not as a ghost, but as the one truth they could never hide from. When their shock settled into silence, I finally spoke, not with anger, but with the cold calm that only 20 years of pain can create. My 7 sons stared at me like they were standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to hear if I would push them or pull them back. I could feel the fear in the room. It was thick, heavy, real. For the first time in their lives, they understood that their choices had consequences that didn't disappear with time. They were about to learn what judgment feels like when it comes from the father they tried to erase. I told them I could take everything back with one phone call, one lawyer, one signature. Their homes, their businesses, their land, their comfort. All of it could disappear faster than they threw me out 20 years ago. Their faces tightened, their hands clenched. They swallowed hard, waiting for the punishment they believed they deserved. But punishment was never my intention. Revenge doesn't rebuild a broken family. Revenge doesn't heal a wounded heart. Revenge doesn't teach men how to be sons again. I didn't return to destroy them. I returned to confront them. I looked each of them in the eye and saw fear mixed with regret. Some had families now, children, wives, lives built on top of lies they told themselves. They weren't boys anymore. They were grown men who suddenly realized they never learned how to be sons. And now they stood in front of the man they betrayed, waiting for a sentence they could not predict. I let the silence stretch until they felt the full weight of it. Then I finally spoke the truth they needed to hear. I told them I wasn't there to take anything back. Not their houses, not their businesses, not their money, not even their comfort. They looked confused, almost relieved. But the relief didn't last long. Because then I told them what I did want. I wanted something they couldn't buy. Something they couldn't lie their way out of. Something they couldn't fake. I wanted their time, their presence, their effort. I wanted them to remember the father they threw away. I wanted them to earn back the place they had crushed with their betrayal. Each of them looked stunned. They didn't expect mercy. They didn't expect anything gentle. They expected war. And instead, I offered responsibility, not gifts, not comfort. Responsibility. I told them they would visit me once a month, not for money, not for inheritance, not for favor. They would visit because a father who survived betrayal deserves respect, not abandonment. They would visit because they needed to rebuild what they broke. They would visit because blood means nothing unless you honor it. They would visit because this time the choice was theirs, not forced by greed or selfishness, but by the desire to become better men. They stared at me in disbelief. Some began to cry quietly, realizing I wasn't asking for payment. I wasn't asking for apologies. I wasn't asking for anything they couldn't give. I was asking for something simple, the chance to be their father again, if they were willing. And that was the hardest judgment of all. Not punishment, not revenge. Responsibility. Responsibility to grow. Responsibility to change. Responsibility to face the truth of who they became. One son fell to his knees, unable to stand under the weight of the moment. Another leaned against the wall, breathing hard as if the truth had winded him. Another covered his face with both hands, ashamed of the man he had allowed himself to become. They weren't crying for me. They were crying for themselves, for the years they lost, for the guilt they carried, for the chance they never expected to receive. I told them my judgment wasn't about taking from them. My judgment was about giving them one chance, one real chance, to choose what kind of men they wanted to be from this day forward. Not for money, not for ownership, but for the father they abandoned, the father who survived, the father who returned. After that day, I walked out of the house with a slow, steady breath, leaving my 7 sons standing in the silence they created for themselves. I didn't take a single paper with me. I didn't take a key, a deed, or a signature. I left everything exactly where it was, not because I was weak, but because time had already judged them far better than I ever could. As I stepped outside, the air felt lighter than it had in 20 years. I didn't feel like the old man they threw away. I felt like a man who survived the kind of pain that shapes the soul. I felt the truth settle inside me. I wasn't empty. I wasn't broken. I wasn't lost. I was free. In the weeks that followed, something strange happened. My sons began to visit me. At first, they came quietly, awkwardly, almost afraid to knock on my door. They stood there like boys again, unsure if I would even open it. I always opened it. Not because they deserved it, but because forgiveness is something a man chooses for himself, not something he gives to others. They sat with me in silence sometimes. Other times they spoke, slowly, stumbling through the words they never learned to say as grown men. They were learning the truth time had always held for them, that I didn't need their money, their apologies, or their property. I needed something simpler: respect. One visit at a time, the walls they built between us started to crack. They didn't break easily. 20 years of distance doesn't disappear overnight, but time has its own way of forcing truth into the open. They learned things about me they never cared to know before. How I survived those first years alone. How I rebuilt myself without asking for help. How I worked in silence, saved every dollar, and learned that the world doesn't end when your own children turn their backs on you. I shared only pieces, never everything. Some stories belong to the man who lived them, not the ones who caused them. They began to understand something they never understood as young men: that strength isn't loud. Strength isn't in ownership or money or control. Strength sits quietly in the heart of a man who refuses to break. They realized I wasn't the weak father they once pushed aside. I was stronger than any of them had ever been, and that realization cut deeper than any punishment I could have given them. They carried their guilt every time they looked at me. They carried the memory of the night they betrayed me, and time made sure they never forgot. Months passed, then years. The visits continued. Sometimes one came, sometimes 2. On rare days, all 7 showed up together, sitting in my small living room like they were trying to relive what they destroyed. They brought food. They helped with chores. They asked questions about my health. They tried to be present, something they never tried before. They weren't perfect men. They weren't healed, but they were trying. And sometimes trying is the truth time demands from those who once failed. As for me, I found peace in a way I never expected. Not because my sons returned, not because they finally understood. I found peace because I realized I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed their love. I no longer needed anything from the people who once broke me. I had already rebuilt myself into a man who stood on his own. My life was no longer shaped by their betrayal. It was shaped by my survival. Now I live in a small home near the edge of town. I grow my own vegetables. I watch the sun rise without rushing. I sit in my chair and breathe without pain pressing on my chest. I am not rich in ways the world counts, but I am rich in ways that matter. I have time. I have peace. I have the truth. And the truth is this: they didn't destroy me 20 years ago. They only made me stronger. I vanished because of their betrayal, but I returned to show them what a father's worth truly is. Time didn't erase the past. It revealed it. It showed them who I became without them. And now they must live with that truth every day. My final thought: a father's strength is not measured by the sons who abandon him, but by the man he becomes when he stands alone.